Welcome back to the Historical Society's Roadshow. We are back with Jean, and we're talking about the old Methodist Church, which they now houses the Berean Baptist congregation. You know, I have been fascinated, Jean, by the appearance on the outside of this church. You know, it reminds me of embroidery for some reason. But everything I've read is that they made it out of dark red concrete blocks. And I'm just wondering, where did they get these blocks?
Where did they get the red?
Well, the red, too. And I've asked around, and have you ever found out?
No.
Well, if someone out there in the area knows where they may have gotten these blocks, I would love to know. Please call me. But it's a very interesting and a unique church. It didn't have a basement right away, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
That came some years later.
It might have come in 1952 because they did a lot of remodeling.
No, I think it was actually earlier. I thought
Earlier
it was
than that?
in the 20s sometime.
Now that I didn't hear about, but I do know in 1952 they remodeled the church.
Yeah, okay. And the congregation just kept growing.
Mm-hmm.
And Lake Avenue is kind of a church street anyway, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, one corner you have the Congregational Church, and then you have the Lutheran Church, and then you have the Methodist Baptist Church, and then you have the Catholic Church, and you have another Lutheran Church. And so we could rename the street, couldn't we?
We could name it the Church Street, yes.
Yes. So you had a number of pastors who came and went.
Mm-hmm.
And did you worship in this church?
No, I did not. I did not come until after the new church was about 5 or 6 years old out on the east side.
On the east side, where the people seem to have moved, then
Yes.
the church moved too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we know the issues of parking and so forth. Tell me something about who some of the old timers are that lived here in Detroit Lakes and then were members of that church.
Well, I have this old scrapbook that Edith Campbell made, and I started this project with the Women's Society, and some of the women that were there were Mrs. G.C. Nunn, Mrs. Charles Bakke, Mrs. Clifford Jones, Mrs. Todd Wright, Grandma Mercer, Mrs. John Bakke, Mrs. Frank, Mrs. W. Jones, Mrs. D. Ferguson, Mrs. Sam Bakke, Mrs. Ralph Jones.
A lot of old names in this town.
Mrs. Chapin, Mrs. E.G. Campbell, Mrs. Martha Goebel, Grandma Stiles, Grandma Wright, Mrs. John Mercer, Mrs. A.E. Bowling, Mrs. Midgley, Mrs. Tom Jones, Mrs. Ben Eames, Mrs. Drew Whitmore, and Mrs. Chadburn, and Mrs. Victor Anderson.
And some of those names are still around. We have Bowling Avenue on the north side. And I noticed that among the pastors, you also had a Wilcox. And a few weeks ago, I guess it was, we did talk about the Wilcox family who wrote the book, you know, the Wilcox, The History of Becker County, and how active they were. About the same time that the church was formed here, Methodist Church, it was also in Frazee. They started one in Frazee.
Yes. And lots of times our pastors would share services.
Okay.
Between Frazee, Vergas, and DL.
Oh, sure. The pastor on a horse, you know, you see those pictures. Yeah. Also, it was called the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Methodist Episcopal.
Yeah, that's sometimes kind of hard to say, isn't it? Yeah, and then they broke off at some point in time, but both had their roots in England.
Yes. John Wesley.
John Wesley, yes.
Mm-hmm.
His mother had something like 17 kids. Right?
I wanted to make some little statement. Ruth Mercer said her father, John Mercer, was contracted to do the wood part of the church.
Okay. So it wasn't all block then, was it?
No, it was wood and concrete, red concrete.
And I just have to say, I'm just fascinated by that. It was red concrete, because at long time I thought it was brick. I think the church cost, was it $15,000 to build, to construct? That was a lot of money back then.
Oh, you bet, you bet. You're lucky to have a quarter.
Yeah. And then they built the parsonage next to it.
Yes.
At a later time.
And I understand the Berean Baptists, when they ran out of room, they put some kind of a intercom or telephone system between them and the parsonage and used it for classrooms and other activities of the church.
Oh,
so they'd have more room. I don't know where the pastor slept, but I do know that there were 2 houses south of it that are still connected to the church, because that's what the town here wanted to buy if they did away with the church.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing this history. And I must tell you, Jean has scrapbook upon scrapbook of material, and a lot of it's up at the Historical Society for people who want to do further research and reading about it. Isn't that right?
I don't think a lot of it is up but I've been trying to condense it into readable notebooks like these.
It's a real gift to the community, and thank you for doing that.
Well, I saw that nobody was doing it, and like genealogy, I felt like somebody's got to step in, whether you're handy with geography or geography,
whatever.
And
well,
history.
Thank you for sharing these moments with us.
Thank you.